with confidence free with TurboTax Live. Get live help from tax experts plus a final review.
Now solve this together. And for this, first of all, I will include exercise.js here in my index.html file instead of app.js, so that the code I do write in exercise.js actually has an effect. So let's save this HTML file and now go back to exercise.js. And here we can start with task number 1, creating free variables. But I think course name isn't too bad of our choice. Now the second variable store our goals. And you learned they are separated with then the course price, and last but not least, the opportunity here, because their names are very similar. They all start with course. So it looks like they actually do belong together, and they distinct three individual where we also group multiple values together is that in an array, we basically have the same kind of value. We have 3 goals here, whereas in an object, we have different kinds of values. And I don't just mean different in the sense of strings and numbers, but instead I mean different things being described by these values. For example, a course name is a different thing than a course description if we had one. Here we have these 3 variables together here, value pairs. And the labels are up to you. So here we could again repeat course name, or since we're already in, I'm actually making sure that we can still see that code, but that it doesn't have any effect anymore. And with that, of course, I can't reference those variables anymore down there, but instead I have to create 3 new values. But it's totally optional whether you want to do that or reference those values. Here I'm creating new values, so now I'll also add a price, which is 39, and then my goals, which is still an array. So we still have the square brackets, and we can have arrays inside of objects as values. We could even have objects inside of objects, that's all allowed. And now we just have to copy these 3 values, these 3 strings, and add them to this new goals array down there, like that. And now I will press this auto format shortcut, and that formats this object such that it's a bit more readable. Now we did group these variables together. Now we should still output their values. And for this we can again use the alert function, but now we don't just use the name or the price as a name here, but instead
Yeah.
These are now labels inside of an object. So we start by using the overall object online course, and then you learn about this dot notation, which you can use to access the different properties stored in there. And here I then access the name property and output this, like this. And then I'll do the same here, access my online course, and then here the price, let's say, this. Task number 4 now is to also output the second element. So become a web developer in my can again putting the entire array, but the second item in there. And for that we can use this square bracket notation here when accessing such an array. This, as you learned, does not create a new array, but it's a special syntax for access.
Oh, I did that. Oh shit. I didn't realize.
An item in the array by its identifier. And you learned that identifiers are automatically assigned to array items. They are numbers starting at 0. And that function should basically, the custom command is a function, and we create such a function with that function keyword. Then you learned that the name is up to you, but it should describe what this function does. And here this function will in the end access a goal, but actually, since that should also be dynamic and it should work on any list, it will access an element in an array. It will access an element in a list, we could say. So here we could name it access list item or get list item, whatever you prefer. And I think that accurately describes what this function will do. Then we add parentheses and now curly braces between which we put our function code. We use curly braces just as we did it for creating an object, but after the function keyword and this syntax, these curly braces do something totally different. They don't create an object, they just mark the beginning and end of this function code. Now in here, we now want to do all the different operations we want to perform. And for that, this function will actually need to use parameters, because both the identifier here, as well as the main goals, should be dynamic. So that list which we access should be dynamic. So hence here, I want to get my list or my array and my identifier or my array index as parameters, so that we can define them in the place where we execute this command later on. And then here in this function, we can add a variable. Array element could be the name, where we access this array, and then again we use the square brackets to access a certain item in this array. That of course has the assumption that the value for this parameter will always be an array, but since we are the one writing this function, we can of course dictate on how it should be used and which values we accept. And it should work on any list. It will, but dynamic, and the list on which we do it should also not be set in stone. Now for that, I will start with the function keyword, because a custom command is a function and we create such a function with that function keyword. Then you learned that the name is up to you, but it should describe what this function does. And here this function will in the end access a goal, but actually, since that should also be dynamic and it should work on any list, it will access an element in an array. It will access an element in a list, we could say. So here we could name it access list item or get list item, whatever you prefer, and I think that accurately describes what this function will do. Then we add parentheses and now curly braces between which we put our function code. We use curly braces just as we did it for creating an object, but after the function keyword and this syntax, these curly braces do something totally different. They don't create an object, they just mark the beginning and end of this function code. Now in here, we now want to do all the different operations we want to perform. And for that, this function will actually need to use parameters, because both the identifier here, as well as the main goals, should be dynamic. So that list which we access should be dynamic. So hence here, I want to get my list or my array and my identifier or my array index as parameters, so that we can define them in the place where we execute this command later on. And then here in this function, we can add a variable. Array element could be the name, where we access this array, and then again we use the square brackets to access a certain item in this array. That, of course, has the assumption that the value for this parameter will always be an array, but since we are the one writing this function, we can of course dictate on how it should be used and which values we accept. So that's absolutely fine. And here, the value which I want to use, and that's now maybe tricky and new, is not a hard-coded number, but the value stored in array index, which I assume to be a number. And that's definitely a tricky step, since that's not something we did before, but it hopefully makes a lot of sense if you think about it. We put a number between square brackets, and instead of writing that number like that, we can of course also write a variable that stores a number. And that's in the end what we're doing here, because parameters inside of a function basically act like variables. And now I'm accessing a certain element in that list, in that array, which we get as a parameter, and I store that accessed element in a new variable. And now it makes most sense to then return this array element here, because with that we ensure that we can use that accessed element in the place where this function is being executed. So that this is a pure utility function that does a certain operation and then yields the result of that operation. That's what I also request here in this last instruction. This custom command should provide, which means return, the accessed value. And now we have our function in place. Now we can use it down there to get our, let's say, first goal, for example, and store it in a variable, which hence is named first goal, by calling getListItem. And you learn for that you repeat your name and then you add parentheses. And then between those parentheses, you pass in the concrete values for these parameters. And here the order does matter. So the first value should be a value for this array, which we expect as a parameter. The second value which we pass in should be a value for this array index. Now the array I want to access here is my online course goals array. So I'm still using the dot notation here, because I want to get access to that array which is stored in my online course object, so to this array here. For that I'm using the dot notation. That's my value for this first parameter. Now we also use a comma here for then passing in a value for the second parameter. And that is the index which I want to access, and since I want to get my first goal here and the index starts at 0, that's 0. And now if I alert my first goal here and I save this, if I go back to my page, here I get learn web development, which indeed is my first goal here. And that's done with help of my function. Now I am 100% aware that this part was probably very challenging and tricky, because you had to apply certain steps which we haven't used exactly like this before, like using two parameters. or providing a variable for the index of an element. If you were still able to do that, congratulations, that's really amazing. If you did struggle a bit with that, that's no problem at all. We're just getting started, and this was a quite challenging exercise, but we are going to see plenty of other examples. Now let's dive back into our app.js file here. And for this, I'll also switch back to app.js here in index.html. We did now learn a lot about values, variables, functions, parameters, return values, and all these important concepts which you are encounter all the time in JavaScript development. To come to an end in this section and lay a solid foundation for the upcoming sections, where we are going to dive deeper, I want to talk about another area where we can use functions. Remember objects? Of course you do. We used them in the exercise a few minutes ago. In objects, up to this point, we grouped together variables, if you want to call it like this. We have related values grouped together into an object, and we have labels to then identify these values. Now, it is also not uncommon that you don't just want to have values like that in an object, but that you also want to have functions inside of an object. So just as you can basically put variables into an object, you can also put functions into that object. And that makes sense if a certain function contains code that works together with the values in that object, or that logically belongs to this kind of object. And to give you an example, I'll add a brand new object down there, and I will name it person, and we created as we learned it with curly braces. And now we could add different label value pairs, for example, for storing a name of that person like Max. But I want to focus on adding a function here. And adding a function here works like this. We could add a greet function, where this person then says hello to us, like this. So basically, as we define a function, we also add a name, parentheses, maybe with parameters if we need them, and then the curly braces. And we do the same here. The only difference is that we don't have the function keyword, just as we don't have the let keyword in front of our properties. So it's basically this. Like this function here works like this. We could add a greet function, where this person then says hello to us, like this. So basically, as we define a function, we also add a name, parentheses, maybe with parameters if we need them, and then the curly braces. And we do the same here. The only difference is that we don't have the function keyword, just as we don't have the let keyword in front of our properties. So it's basically the same, just for a function. We could accept parameters here, but we could also say that this is a very simple function, which then just says hello by using the built-in alert command. That's how we could add such a function to an object. And if we add a function to an object, we typically call that a method. So a function in an object is called a method, just as a variable in an object is called a property. So here we call this a property, we call this a method. But it technically still is a function, of course. And here we now again also see an example for a function or a method that does not take any parameters and that does not return anything. Because for this function, and the kind of operation it's performing, we don't need to return anything. Just executing another function is all we need here. And in that case, it's perfectly fine to define a function like this without return value and without parameters. No matter if it's a method or not, you can write functions without parameters and or without return values. But now the question is, how do we execute this function in this object? We don't execute it like this. That would be the function name, but But just as you can't access the property like this, you also can't access a function just like this. That won't work. Instead, we do access a function in an object, so a method, just as we access other values in an object by using that dot notation. We can access the object name, person, and then a dot, and then in here we have this greet method. And we see the difference between properties and methods here in this suggestions pop-up. Properties have this blue box, methods have this purple box, which is shaped differently. But then we still execute it as we learned it, so by using its name and adding parentheses thereafter. And if this function would need any parameters, we could still pass the parameter values here between these parentheses. But here we don't need that. And with this, if we save that and I reload, I still get my old boxes, and then I get this hello box, which is coming from inside my method. And that is something which we'll also need a little bit later in the course, but most importantly, something which we will use indirectly on certain built-in objects. And in the next lecture, I'll explain what I mean with that. Now we know about methods. And I did want to talk about methods right now already, because whilst we for the moment won't define our own methods too often, we will actually work with quite a bit of built-in methods throughout this and the next sections. And here's a good example. Up to this point, I always used alert for outputting something. And the advantage is that we do see that right here on the screen in this alert box. The disadvantage is that we always have to click it away and so on. And since this is all just a dummy example anyways, to get started with JavaScript and learn these basics, this of course is not code that does anything useful which we would need on a real page. Since that's the case, it would be nice to not have this alert, but instead we have this console. Here in the developer tools, this console tab. And we did see that in here we get error messages that might be caused by our code. Well, it turns out that we can not just see possible error messages, of which we hopefully don't have too many, but we can also actively output data and information into this console. We can log data into this console so that we see it here. And during development, for learning JavaScript and for playing around with it, that's great. It's quicker and simply easier to use than working with that alert box. Now for that, we will use a built-in object provided by the browser and a method that's built into this object out of the box. And I'll start here when I first alert something. Instead of calling this alert command, which is also built in, I will now remove that and instead use the built-in console variable in the end. It's provided by the browser, which turns out to store an object. Hence we can use the dot notation here, and now we see there are a bunch of methods built in. You learned these purple boxes, which are shaped like this, are methods. We also have one property here. Now for us, the log method is very useful. So here I'll select this by clicking on it, and now as it's a method, we execute it by adding parentheses. Now this log method wants a parameter value, and we can see this if I hover over it. We see that it's a method, and then this part here all looks a bit strange, but in the end that means that it takes a flexible amount of parameters. It's not something we have learned about yet, but it means it takes parameters. That's all we need to know for now. And then this part here, void, simply means that that's a method that won't return any value. Void means this method or this function does not return anything. That's how we can read this. And since it takes parameters, we can pass total adult years as a parameter. We can see that it takes any kind of value. That's what this means. So passing in a number, which total adult years will be, should be fine. We can do this here as well. Replace alert with console log. And also here in our greet method. Replace alert with console log. We can use this built-in variable and method inside of our own method. That works without issues. And as a side note, if you now hover over your own method here, you also get some extra here by Visual Studio Code. We see that it's a method and that this also doesn't return anything because we have no return statement in there and that we take no parameters. On the other hand, for a calculate adult years, we see that we need an age. Here the type is anything, which is technically not correct, but Visual Studio Code doesn't understand that we need a number in there. But we see that it will return a number in the end because we return the result of this calculation. That's just a side note, but also useful to use when you want to find out how you can execute your own or built-in methods and functions. But back to console log. I'm now using console log in all the places where I used alert. And if I now save that, you see that now after reloading, you get this output here in this console tab in your browser DevTools. And that's more convenient than having to deal with these alerts. And if you reload this page, you get this output again. And here you see two numbers and then some text. Text is white, numbers are purple here in my case when using this dark mode. And that's how we use a built-in variable which holds an object which has this log method. And that's why I wanted to introduce methods, because console log is just one example of a built-in method which we'll use a lot. We'll use it a lot to output information without using alert, which is more disturbing and a bit more annoying. Of course, I want to emphasize again that console log is producing output which we only see in these developer tools. And the typical user of our page, of course, won't see them. Everyone could open these tools, but no one typically does that. It's just there for us to practice JavaScript. We will do more useful things with JavaScript.